Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition.
It's great to be here. Today we are discussing a really powerful book, Morningside, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre, and the Struggle for an American City's Soul by Aran Shetterly.
And before we jump in, we do need to state clearly that the voices you're hearing are generated by AI, but all the content, all the substance comes directly from the book.
Exactly. And we really feel this is a fantastic way to engage with and learn about African American history.
For sure. And we'll make sure that if any complex topics or, specific terms come up, we'll break them down and explain what they mean as we go.
Absolutely. We want everyone to follow along.
We also just want to say thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for more content like this. After you hear our conversation, we really hope you'll go out and purchase Morningside. It's so important to support the author.
So let's get into it.
I want to take you to a specific place and time. It's November 2nd, 1979. We're in Greensboro, North Carolina, and there's this bungalow, just a normal house on a corner, but inside it is just buzzing with energy.
A total hive of activity.
Right. And the people inside, it's not the mix you'd expect. You have doctors there standing shoulder to shoulder with mill workers. You've got Black activists and white activists all together making signs, practicing chants. There's a real electricity in the air.
They were getting ready for a march. The very next day, November 3rd. And this wasn't just a generic protest. They were marching specifically and very loudly against the Ku Klux Klan.
And this is where the story pivots, because the next day, what was supposed to be a public permitted march turned into 88 seconds of gunfire.
5 people were killed. It's now known as the Greensboro Massacre.
And the whole book sort of circles this one central question. How on earth does a legal protest in broad daylight end with people being shot down while the police are nowhere to be found?
To get that answer, you have to understand who was in that bungalow. The group was called the Communist Workers' Party, the CWP.
Now, that word communist, especially in 1979, is incredibly loaded. This is the Cold War. But this group wasn't what you might picture.
Not at all. It was this fascinating mix of people. You had, as you said, doctors like Jim Waller and Paul Berman's son. These are highly educated guys.
Right.
But they weren't just writing checks. They quit their medical careers to go work on the floor of textile mills, trying to organize unions from the inside.
Which is a huge leap. Why would a doctor do that?
They had this guiding philosophy. The book highlights this analogy they use all the time. They called it the whole parable.
I thought this part was so clarifying. Can you walk us through it?
Sure. So imagine you're a doctor. Every day, people come into your office with a broken leg. You set the bone, you put on a cast, you send them home. But they just keep coming.
More and more broken legs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So finally, the doctor stops, looks at his window, and he sees a giant hole in the sidewalk that everyone keeps falling into.
So he has a choice. Do I keep setting bones forever, or do I go outside and fill the hole?
That's it. And for the CWP, filling the hole was about tackling the system itself. Capitalism, in their view. They believed just treating the symptoms, the poverty, the injuries, was pointless if the cause was still there.
A really powerful metaphor. And the person really leading this charge was Nelson Johnson.
Nelson Johnson is the absolute core of this story. He was a Black leader, came up in the Black Power movement. But what's so interesting is how he evolved. He started to see things beyond just the racial divide.
He started to see it as a class issue.
He did. He was trying to bring Black and white workers together against the mill owners. He believed they had more in common with each other than with their white bosses. And, that kind of idea is terrifying to the establishment.
But not everyone was on board with the plan to confront the Klan so directly. Let's talk about Big Man.
Right, Thomas Anderson. Everyone called him Big Man. And he was kind of the voice of experience in this room full of idealists. He'd worked in the mills for decades. He'd seen it all.
And he warned them, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. He was blunt. He told them, and this is a quote, "Greensboro is about the craziest city in the South."
Wow, craziest city in the South. That really lands.
He knew the history. He told them, if you go looking for a fight with the Klan, you're going to find one, and it's going to be violent. He was basically saying, the Klan had a long history of killing people and getting away with it. Your theories aren't going to stop their bullets.
He was right to be worried, because across town, this alliance was forming between the KKK and the American Nazi Party.
A united front of hate, as the book calls it. You had Virgil Griffin, the KKK Grand Dragon, but the key figure, the one who really orchestrates this, is a man named Eddie Dawson.
Dawson is such a chilling character, and he's more than just a Klansman.
Way more. He was a police informant, but he was also a provocateur.
Okay, let's break those terms down because that's a critical distinction.
It is. So an informant just gives the police information.
Yep.
A provocateur, on the other hand, actively stirs up trouble. They incite violence.
And Dawson was doing both.
He was literally on the payroll of the Greensboro Police Department, supposedly to give them intel. But Shetterly's book shows he was also recruiting for the Klan, riling them up, and even getting into a poster war with the CWP.
Right. The CWP puts up death to the Klan posters.
And Dawson goes around pasting over them with an image of a lynched man that says, "Traitors beware." I mean, he is escalating things while being paid by the police to keep the peace.
There's that one bizarre detail about him, too. His hobby.
The Weary Willie clown figurine.
Yes, it's so strange.
He had a den filled with these little statues of sad hobo clowns. It's just this peek into the psychology of a man who is planning a massacre but goes home to his melancholy collectibles.
And his connection to the police gave him the ultimate advantage.
He had the parade permit. The police gave it to him. So he knew the marchers' exact route, block by block, and he gave that information directly to the Klan.
So when we ask how the Klan knew exactly where to be and when...
The answer is the police department's informant told them.
So we get to the morning of November 3rd. The activists are gathering at a place called Morningside Homes. What's the significance of that spot?
Morningside Homes was a black public housing community. It was meant to be a stepping stone for families, but by 1979, it was pretty neglected. It was the perfect symbol of the hole they wanted to fill. It was a community they were there to defend.
So you have this scene, families, kids, protesters on a Saturday morning, and then this caravan of cars rolls up.
Led by Dawson, 9 vehicles full of Klansmen and Nazis. As the protesters start chanting, "Death to the Klan," the cars stop and the men get out.
There's always some confusion about who fired the first shot.
There is, though most witnesses say it was a Klansman who fired a pistol into the air. But what's not confusing is the weaponry. The protesters had picket signs, maybe a few had handguns. The Klan and Nazis opened their trunks and pulled out shotguns, rifles, heavy-duty weapons.
And what about that story the defense used about a butcher knife?
A total myth, basically. The idea was that an activist attacked a car, justifying the shooting. But the reality, the ballistics, it wasn't a fight. It was an ambush, an execution.
88 seconds. It's almost impossible to imagine.
And in that minute and a half, 5 people were shot and killed. Jim Waller, Bill Sampson, Caesar Koss, Mike Nathan, and Sandy Smith.
The book really pauses on Sandy Smith.
It does. She was the only black victim killed that day. A nurse, a mother. The book describes how she was shot between the eyes while trying to find cover. It was precise.
And throughout all this, the gunfire, the screams, where were the police?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Their tactical team was ordered to stay several blocks away. They knew the Klan was armed. They knew they were coming. But the official order was to maintain a low profile.
A low profile? What does that even mean?
They said they didn't want to escalate the situation with a heavy police presence. But the result was they gave the Klan and the Nazis a clear field to operate.
After the shooting stopped, a different kind of battle began. The battle over the narrative.
And this is where it gets really insidious. For the first few hours, the media called it what it was, a massacre. But almost immediately, city officials and newspapers started shifting the language. They started calling it a shootout.
And those words mean very different things. A massacre is an attack. A shootout is.
It's mutual combat. It suggests 2 equal fringe groups just slugging it out. It's classic both sidesism. It creates this false equivalency.
And it gets the city and the police off the hook.
Exactly. If it's a shootout, then the police don't have a duty to protect citizens from an attack. They're just cleaning up a mess between 2 sets of extremists. The word choice was absolutely strategic.
A strategy that played out in the courtroom.
Devastatingly so. 2 state criminal trials, both with all-white juries. And even with news footage of the killings, the shooters were acquitted.
Found not guilty.
Not guilty. On the grounds of self-defense and, get this, patriotic duty, their lawyers argued they were protecting America from communism.
That must have been just a soul-crushing blow for the survivors.
It confirmed everything Big Man had warned them about. The Klan can kill you in broad daylight, on camera, and walk free. The message to the black community was terrifyingly clear.
But they didn't give up. There was a civil suit.
That was their last shot. They sued the Klan, the Nazis, and importantly, the Greensboro Police Department for civil rights violations. And this time, they won. The jury found them all jointly liable.
So there was a legal finding of police responsibility.
Yes. It was symbolic in some ways, but it established in a court of law that the police were, at minimum, negligent and complicit in the violence.
But the city itself just wanted to forget. The book talks about how they literally tried to erase the location.
They did. They demolished Morningside homes, built a new development on the site called Willow Oaks. It's that impulse to just pave over the ugly parts of history.
But it doesn't work that way. Which brings us to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC. I mean, that sounds like something out of post-apartheid South Africa.
That's the model. A TRC is what you do when the courts have failed. It's not about prison time, it's about getting the truth onto the public record. In 2004, the community, against the wishes of the city, started their own.
And Virgil Griffin, the Klan leader, actually testified.
He did. He showed up.
Did he show any remorse?
Not a bit. He was completely unrepentant. He sat there and told the commission, maybe God guided the bullets.
That's just chilling.
Horrifying. But in a strange way, that was the point of the TRC. To force that ugliness out into the open, to put it on the record so no one could deny it was there.
It still took the city itself years to catch up. Decades, really.
All the way to 2020. And you have to remember the context. This is right after the murder of George Floyd. The whole country is talking about police brutality. And in that environment, the Greensboro City Council finally, officially, apologized.
And it happened on a Zoom call.
Yeah, during the pandemic. You have Nelson and Joyce Johnson, elderly now, looking at a computer screen, finally hearing the city of Greensboro say, "We failed to protect you."
It's such a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a 40-year fight, but profound.
It is. It's a testament to their endurance. The book's final message is that democracy isn't something you have, it's something you do. It's this slow, painful grind. But the truth, if you keep fighting for it, eventually comes out.
It all comes back to that doctor in the hole in the sidewalk.
It really does.
Which leaves a question for you, for everyone listening. If the activists in 1979 were trying to fill the hole in their society, what are the holes we're looking at today?
Right. And are we okay just setting the broken bones, just reacting to the symptoms? Or are we willing to go outside, pick up a shovel, and start trying to fix the pavement?
A lot to think about there. Well, we want to thank you again for listening to this episode of the African American Books Edition. If you got something out of this conversation, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us a ton.
And please tell your friends about the podcast. We also really want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what other books you'd like us to cover in the future.
And please go out and purchase a copy of Morningside by Aran Shetterly. The book is incredible. Thank you for subscribing and for listening. We'll talk to you next time.